kind of a cool phone.
Yes.
I mean, except for having, like, you know, all the next phase do on it. Wasn't too long. All right, I'm going to get started. My name is Dave Rolsky, and I'm going to be talking about Fey and Fey ORM. If you thought I was bad pound or something, I'm not. Thank you for closing the door. I've also done, besides Fey and Fey ORM, I've worked on things like core moose development, datetime, Mason, and various other things. So, all right, here we go. So the first question that might reasonably be asked is, oh, also I should say, I tend to talk kind of fast, and that's probably okay when I'm giving presentations in the US, but less okay here. So if I talk too fast, just like tell me to slow down, okay? So anyway, so why another ORM? It's a good question. I mean, why would anybody write another ORM in this day and age? There's already, I don't know how many on CPAN, 20, 30, 40, 50, maybe 100. I really wouldn't be surprised if there was 100 crappy little ORMs. So why make it 101 crappy little ORMs? So I wrote this other ORM called Alzabo a long time ago, which maybe a few of you might have had the misfortune of using. Actually, it was one of the very first ORMs written for Perl. It came out around the same time as Class CBI, about 10 years ago. I still liked parts of it, but I was really, really sick of it at the same time. But I thought I had some ideas in there that were kind of right and that other ORMs weren't doing. So I wanted something similar, but modern. You know, Alzabo is really its old code. The APIs are just reflect my ideas from 10 years ago. It just wasn't really there. And I did look at Dybbuk's class. It just doesn't fit my brain. And you know, as I go on, you'll probably see exactly how Fey ORM works and the Fey tool that lies underneath it, and maybe that'll be more clear how they're different. So, kind of the Fey project anatomy consists of a bunch of parts. There's a distro on CPAN called just Fey, and that's kind of these core modules that the other tools use. So there's Fey Loader, which is a tool for loading a schema definition that's already defined in your database. DBI Manager just manages DBI handles. There's actually something that somebody uploaded, a Dybbuk's module on CPAN recently that actually does something very similar, so I may just make this a very thin wrapper around that. There's a test distribution, which you don't need to worry about, and then there's the ORM and a mocking tool for the ORM. So the first part I'm going to talk about, that's really helpful, is stop in Ubuntu, stop. Normally these messages are kind of cool, the way it flashes up there, and not so great when you're giving a presentation. So the first part I'm going to talk about is the Fey core part, and that's mostly about SQL generation. So these classes, Fey SQL, which are basically there's Fey SQL select, and insert, and update, delete, just like you'd expect. There's classes for literals like numbers and strings, and functions like SQL functions, placeholders. And so here's an example of making a SQL function. Oh, these colors are really weird compared to what I actually have. Anyway, so you make a literal function object and you pass the function name, and then you can pass a column object out of the track table, and you can make a select this way, and I'll get into more detail. So here's a more detailed example of how you make a select. So we have a select object, and we call select. We're going to select from everything from the track table, and then we're going to join these two tables. If you just pass table objects to the from method, Fey can figure out how to join them, assuming they have a foreign key. If they don't have a foreign key, you can actually give it more explicit instructions on how to join them, even if they don't, or if they have multiple foreign keys, you also have to be explicit. You can do where clauses, so you can say where the year is greater than, and this will be a placeholder, and the length is greater than the average track length, and that was average track length was the function we defined in the previous slide. And then you can order by columns, and then you can just execute it with standard DBI methods. So Fey also does this thing called auto placeholders. So if you make a select and then you pass in literal values, so here we have where the year is equal to, and we just passed 2005, and here we're passing some sort of ID. What happens is by default it will see that you passed in some sort of literal, capture it, and then replace it with a placeholder in the generated SQL. And then, so here we generate the SQL, then you can get the bind parameters out of the select object that it captured. You can turn this off if you want and make it actually put literal values into the generated SQL string, in which case it will do proper quoting, but I kind of figured that most people probably want placeholders because this is 2010, and that's the way to do it, unless maybe you're using Sybase, which still doesn't really support them properly because it's the biggest piece of shit in the world, and I have to work with it on a daily basis. But otherwise, placeholders are definitely the way to go. So the kind of core philosophy of this tool, and also Fey ORM and the other tools built around it, is that it assumes you know SQL and you want to leverage that knowledge. So as we saw, the SQL generation code, it's kind of verbose, it looks like SQL, it uses the same terms as SQL, like select, where, and order by. And it uses very simple data structures that you pass to that, or you pass objects that represent things like a table or a column. And I say this in contrast to SQL Abstract. How many people have used SQL Abstract? Okay. So SQL Abstract is very much the opposite, in my opinion. It's just a lot of magic. Like, if you pass a reference to a scalar, that means one thing. If you pass a plain scalar, it means something else. If you pass an array reference with things, that means make this comparison. If you pass a hash reference, do something else. I have looked at the documentation for this, and it just boggles my mind, because it's basically it's arbitrary. It was like, well, okay, Perl, I have these things, hash references, scalar references. I'll just randomly assign them these different things. Now, it works, and I think some people like it, and that's cool. I don't really like it. I find it very confusing. I could never, ever remember it. I already know SQL. I can remember select, from, where, order by. So this makes it easy. The other thing is, I'm a big fan of explicitness for low-level APIs. I see this as kind of a low-level thing. If you wanted to build something like SQL Abstract or some sort of devel-declare-based DSL type of thing, you could really do it very easily on top of Fey, because it provides a very primitive kind of low-level, straightforward mapping to SQL. So I feel like if you want to build a fancy tool, you should start by building a simple tool. So if somebody wanted to rebuild SQL Abstract on top of it, or build some other tool that was more magic, I think this would make it really easy. Any questions so far? Feel free to just raise your hand. I know people don't do that here as much. Man, when I give talks in the US, people just won't shut the fuck up. hey, what about, Anyway. So, you might be wondering, why would I use this? Because it's really, really verbose. That example I showed you it was like typing SQL, but with more infix operators and $signs. So why would you do this? So, if you are just working on an application where you already pretty much know what all the SQL statements are going to be as you write the app, and there's nothing really dynamic about it, you're not going to get much out of this tool. It really doesn't do much for you. However, I find myself often working on projects where I have to generate a very complex or even moderately complex SQL query based on user input. So maybe if the user asks to search for things, let's use a CD example. It's searching for things where the artist would have their first release in some year, and the album has less than 7 tracks, and the average rating for the album is above 3 stars or something like that. And maybe sometimes they don't care about the rating, and sometimes they don't care about the artist year, they care about album release years or whatever. So you have a lot of different parameters, some of which may be present in different searches. If you've ever tried to dynamically construct SQL, say by using string snippets of SQL and kind of concatenating them together, then you've probably experienced the feeling I had of wanting to kill myself because it was so incredibly difficult to get right. Fey makes this a lot easier. For example, it does the auto joins that I showed you and things like that. So if you are writing apps where you have to generate complex dynamic SQL, I think it might be a good tool for you. Fey can support almost, I say any query, that's a little bold, almost any query I should say. It definitely handles sub-selects. It can handle very complex outer joins like this, where you have an outer join and a where clause on the outer join. I actually found myself having to do this. It's not that uncommon. I think people that don't know SQL don't realize you can do these things, and then they end up just doing this sort of stuff in code. But you can actually, make good use of your database with sort of certain complex queries. Like I mentioned, it does these auto joins where when you ask it to join two tables, if they have one foreign key, it figures out what to do. If during the process of generating SQL, you ask it to join the same two tables twice, it just ignores that. It's also completely decoupled from an ORM. So you can use this stuff, this Fey thing, all by itself. You don't need to have any sort of ORM on top of it. And I know there are people out there using it that way. In fact, as far as I know, I might be the only person using the ORM piece, but there are a bunch of people who are just using Fey itself. So I think that's also a nice feature, that it's a tool that stands alone. And I also say it's not too helpful in that it doesn't try too hard to guess exactly what you're thinking and get it right. It lets you basically more or less do what you ask it to do, which means you can generate totally bogus SQL, but it also means you can generate really complex stuff, and I don't have to explicitly support every possible option. I just let you pass some parameters, and it does the best it can. Any questions about Fey, the core distro part? So I mentioned this Fey loader piece. There's really not too much to say about it. It's quite simple. Basically, you point at your DBMS, you make a new loader, give it a database handle, and then you call make schema. And it'll make a schema for you. Right now it works with SQLite, Postgres, and MySQL. Some people have asked about supporting other databases. I'm not going to do it, but I'm happy to have somebody else do it. It uses these methods that DBI provides, like primary key info and table info, and in theory, all the database, the DVD modules are supposed to support them. In practice, I've had to write various little hacks in the loader code itself to kind of monkey patch some of those methods in. Support at this point in Postgres, the Postgres and MySQL drivers is pretty complete. I think Oracle might also be pretty good. I think it must be because Tim Bunce wrote the Oracle driver originally and he came up with all these APIs. I would be shocked if the Sybase driver supports it. Again, it's Sybase. Who would want to use it? It's just a nightmare. So it wouldn't be too hard to add support for another database depending on how complete its support for these info methods is. So I would say if you're going to use Fey loader as well. You can define the schema, you saw me using the table and column objects. You can define all that in Perl, like Fey schema, new, and then add table, add column, which would be incredibly tedious and painful. Instead, you can just define your schema in SQL the way, well, I won't say dog intended you to, and you can just instantiate your schema in the database and then point Fey loader at it. Really, 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 really hate the idea of defining schemas in Perl code. Just makes no sense. So you can also get some introspection information out of this. So you can get, you make your schema and then you can look at the tables, you can look at the columns, print the names, print their types, you can print out foreign keys and whatever. It only supports the logical schema, since that's all that's needed to generate SQL. So it doesn't touch any of the, it doesn't look at any of the definitions related to the physical layout of your schema, in particular indexes, or some DBMSs support things like table spaces and things like that, which are really just about the physical layout on disk of your system. It doesn't care about that. So it just schema, table, columns, foreign keys. That's it. It also doesn't care about triggers or stored procedures or domains or anything like that, because it doesn't really need, again, it doesn't need to know about that to generate the SQL it's generating. You could call the stored procedure like any other function. All right, yes, question?